Welcome. I'm Bill Saunders. I am a fellow with the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The Institute for Human Ecology is an academic institute committed to multidisciplinary research and reflection on human flourishing in light of Catholic social teaching. As part of my responsibilities, I'm a human rights lawyer and I direct a program in human rights. In fact, a graduate program, a Master of Arts in Human Rights. You can find out more about the program at our either through the IHE website, which is ihe.catholic.edu, or mahumanrights.com. The Master of Arts in Human Rights is an interdisciplinary degree program which is offered through the School of Arts and Sciences. It draws on insights from law, philosophy, theology, canon law, and political theory. It's a one-year master's program, the aim of which is to equip students to enter into public conversation about rights and human rights and justice in our society. So you won't be surprised to know that I was thrilled with the creation of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, and I was able, before the pandemic hit, to take my students to a meeting or two, public meeting or two of the Commission. Tonight, this is the third annual Human Rights Lecture, and tonight our speakers are three members of the Commission, which I will introduce to you now, and then I will tell you a little bit more about the program and about the report. The first member is Christopher Tollefson. He's College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor and Chair of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He works in natural law ethics and the ethics of truth-telling and assertion. He is the author of Lying in Christian Ethics, Cambridge in 2014, and co-editor of a collection on about Joseph Boyle, the philosopher Joseph Boyle, which was just published this year by the Catholic University of America, entitled Natural Law Ethics in Theory and Practice, a Joseph Boyle Reader. Chris, I don't know if our names are on the screens. Maybe you could just give a little wave to everybody. There you go. The second speaker will be Paolo Carozza, who is a professor of law and political science at the University of Notre Dame, where he also directs the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. In addition to his academic work in human rights and comparative constitutional law, he has served as a member and as president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and is currently the U.S. member of the European Commission for Democracy Through Law. Follow? Kenneth Anderson is professor of law at the Washington College of Law, American University in Washington, D.C. Prior to becoming a professor, he worked for several leading international human rights organizations and global philanthropies. As a scholar, he has written extensively on international human rights, international organizations, and national security and the rules and the laws of war. So how will we proceed tonight? First, I will talk a little bit about, a very little bit about the report itself and kind of introduce it to you. And then the report is in several sections, but perhaps the three major sections, each of the speakers will address separately. So Chris will talk about the American rights tradition, which is section 1, and then Paolo will talk about U.S. commitments to international rights principles, which is section 2. And then Ken will talk about human rights and U.S. foreign policy, which is the third major section. After they've done that, I'll have a word or two to say and brief summary of some of the conclusions. Then I'll have a question or two for the panelists, and then we'll open it up to you for any of your questions. So let me start, and you know, I'm old school, so I have a printed copy of the report, and I don't just read these things online. So I think some ways the best to do fairness to the report is let it speak for itself. It's so why do we have a commission, and why is there a commission issuing a report? Well, as the introduction says, after World War II, the world did a number of things to make sure that the global atrocities that the world had experienced during the Second World War were not repeated. And they took several different actions. They established United Nations, and then in 1948, the United Nations issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'll read a couple of sentences from the report, from the introduction. To the surprise of skeptics, the human rights idea gathered strength in subsequent decades. It played a key role in movements leading to the demise of apartheid in South Africa, the toppling of totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe, and the decline of military dictatorships in Latin America. And in the United States, the promotion of human rights became a principal goal of foreign policy. And recently, however, there have been some significant challenges to the human rights idea. As the report states, some nations like China promote a conception of human rights that denies civil and political liberties. Further erosion of human rights project has resulted from widespread disagreement about the nature and scope of basic rights, disappointment in the performance of international institutions, and overuse of rights language. Meanwhile, more than half the world's population suffers under regimes where the most basic freedoms are systematically denied. At the same time, new risks to human freedom and dignity are emerging in the form of new technological advances, such as artificial intelligence and things like that. So in light of these challenges, U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo determined in 2019 that it was time for an informed review of the role of human rights in a foreign policy that serves American interests, reflects American ideals, and meets the international obligations that the United States has assumed. To that end, he established the Commission on Unalienable Rights. The Commission's charge, as stated in the charter, is, quote, not to discover new principles, but to furnish advice to the Secretary for the promotion of individual liberty, human equality, and democracy through U.S. foreign policy, end quote. The charter further states that the Commission's advice is to be, quote, grounded in our nation's founding principles and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, end quote. The introduction essentially concludes with this. The undersigned commissioners, like our fellow Americans, are not of one mind on many issues, but with hundreds of millions of men and women around the world suffering extreme forms of deprivation under harsh authoritarian regimes, we are of one mind on the urgent need for the United States to vigorously champion human rights in its foreign policy. So that's the setting for the report. That's what the Secretary of State asked the Commission to do. And now, as I said, we'll hear from Chris Tollefson on the first major section of the report, the distinctive American rights tradition.
Great, thanks very much, Bill. Let me just start by saying what real privilege and pleasure it was to work on this commission. Everybody on it was a delight. It's such a great thing to see Ken and Paolo again. And Bill, it was nice to see you too at some of these meetings. Mary Ann Glendon's work was just spectacular. It was a real life learning experience for me to see her in action and to just watch how she guided this from beginning to end. As Bill mentioned, the introduction talks about widespread disagreement about the nature and scope of human rights. And I think those issues are taken up most clearly in this first section that I'm going to talk about. And that section also talks about the transcendent foundations and ultimate sources of these rights. And so those are the three things that I'm going to talk about: the nature of rights, the scope of rights, and the ultimate sources of rights. So there's three parts to the what I'm going to have to say. So the first, on the nature of rights, we sometimes say that I have a right to something as a way of emphasizing its importance or identifying something that we have an interest in. But I think as a conceptual matter, rights are correlative to duties, and they signify what's due to someone. And this notion of what's due points in two directions. It indicates the existence of the right holder and the duty bearer, and they're bound in a relationship of justice. So when something's identified as a right, this means that someone, and perhaps many people, have duties, the fulfillment of which satisfies that rights claim. And the duty might be to provide something, some form of assistance, or it might be to refrain from some action, some form of coercion, for example. I think a further point that's worth making is that a true human right needs to be genuinely beneficial for the rights holders. So rights claims shouldn't be made when the subject is merely something that happens to be desired. The fact that something is autonomously chosen isn't sufficient for it being a rights claim. You need to show that what is desired or chosen is genuinely valuable or good, and you need to show that it's possible to identify a duty holder as well. So those are the two conditions that I think need to be met. And these claims suggest the following points. The first, the most important, the fundamental relationship of rights to responsibilities that I think really captures a large part of the nature of rights. The fundamental relationship is that relationship of correlativity. When one person has a right, another or others must have duties in relation to that person and her right. I actually think that we could have been a little bit more explicit about this in the report, although I think it's present there. But there's an additional relationship that rights have to duties that we are more explicit about, and I think is also very important. Some rights are justified by the presence of a duty on the part of the right holder. And the founders recognized this. The right to religious exercise was, Madison argued, grounded in the duties that human persons have towards the Creator. Similarly, parental rights are partly justified as necessary for the fulfillment of parental responsibilities. Rights to free inquiry and speech are justified in part by duties to seek the truth. And some rights are clearly defeasible when there's been a failure to meet responsibilities. So one's rights as a parent or as a citizen can be limited if one hasn't met one's obligations as a parent or a citizen. But I think it's important that not all rights are like this. Many don't depend in any way on one's meeting any responsibilities, and some are not lost even when one is guilty of the most egregious moral failures. So when our report says, quote, rights, whether unalienable or positive, do not exist in a vacuum, they imply responsibilities, beginning with the responsibility to respect the rights of others. I think this isn't wrong, but we need to be sure not to misinterpret it. What we're calling in the document basic or human or unalienable rights, they don't all begin with the responsibilities of the right holder. So for example, children have fundamental and unalienable rights long before they're mature enough to have responsibilities. And not all rights are lost with the failure to meet responsibilities. No amount of wrongdoing, for example, can justify torture or enslavement or violations of bodily integrity. And the reason I think for this is simple. The obligations that we have not to torture or enslave or violate bodily integrity of others are absolute obligations. They don't depend upon the actions of others, but really only upon the human nature that is possessed by other human beings. And that's a point that I'm going to come back to. Now, a second point I think also follows. Rights, in order to be politically effective, must be specified by identifying both their content and also the bearer of the responsibility that's correlative to the right. And this means that many of the rights that are identified in manifestos, such as the Universal Declaration, need further specification in a political context. So the question we could ask is, how is that to be done? In our report, we say, quote, "The most fundamental distinction is between unalienable rights, sometimes referred to as natural rights in the founding era and today commonly called human rights, and positive rights." And then a bit further on, we say, quote, "To say that positive rights are not universal is not to deny their importance, and to say that they're distinct from unalienable rights is not to deny that the two can be closely connected in political affairs. Unalienable rights provide a standard by which positive rights and positive law can be judged, while positive rights and positive law make the promise of unalienable rights concrete by giving expression to and instantiating unalienable rights." Now, I think that's to say that positive rights do the work of identifying with clarity the content of a natural right, such as the right to life, the obligations that are incumbent upon persons other than the right holder to protect that right, and the identity of those people with those obligations. So the relationship between unalienable rights and positive law is normatively a reciprocal relationship. I think this gives an important clue to what we call the narrative structure of our document, especially part 2 of the document. The long history traced from the settlement of 17th century British subjects to the successes of the civil rights movement is precisely the history of a nation struggling to realize unalienable rights in its civic life through positive law. And as we admit in the prefatory note to the report, there is still unfinished business on this score. So then moving to the question of the scope of fundamental rights. Unalienable rights, human rights, or in an older tradition, natural rights, I think all identify the same realities, albeit with differences of emphasis. Human rights are those rights that pertain to human beings in virtue of their humanity. Natural rights indicates that these rights pertain in virtue of human nature. Unalienable rights draws attention to an important fact. Since human nature cannot be lost by a human person without that person ceasing to exist, it follows that human natural rights also cannot be lost or alienated while that human being exists. So the fundamental question of the scope of human rights is to be answered as follows. Human rights are precisely predicated of all human beings in virtue of their humanity. Now, of course, some rights can't be realized apart from a specifically political society, such as the right to political representation or the right to a fair trial. And this doesn't mean that these rights aren't human rights. Rather, they're human rights that have no application outside political society. And similarly, just as civil and political rights require a political context to have application, so do social and economic rights require a certain context. In particular, the rights that people ordinarily have to be given aid by those who are able, without serious sacrifice, to provide it, don't become rights in relation to states until those states are able to take on the corresponding obligations. So an economically developed state typically has obligations to its people, and its people have rights and relationships to the state in regards to their material welfare that a developing or impoverished state and its people don't have, I think. So the fact that some rights apply only in certain circumstances is no threat to the claim that human rights belong to human beings as such. By contrast, I think a real threat is to be found in the contemporary use of the word person to designate a subset of the class of human beings as the subject of basic rights. On a plausible account of human beings, all human beings are persons. They're individuals with a rational nature. But just as in the past, various discriminations between human beings were used to deprive some human beings of their rights, so too today, the language of personhood is used to discriminate between those who, because capable of more or less immediately of exercising their rational faculties, may not be killed or used, and those who, because of the immaturity of their development, their advanced age or incapacity, or their cognitive disability, may be. Now, it was, I think, importantly, we can talk about this, importantly beyond the mandate of our report to address these issues, these concrete issues. But it was important, I think, that we clearly identify the nature of those beings that hold unalienable rights, and we did this. So here's a quotation from our document, quote, "Human beings never lose their unalienable rights, though they can be violated, because such rights are essential to the dignity and capacity for freedom that are woven into human nature." So human beings and human nature, the bookends of, I think, that very crucial sentence in the report. Finally, source of human rights. The claim that human rights pertain to human beings in virtue of their human nature and their humanity naturally raises questions about that nature. What is it about human nature that grounds the possession of unalienable human rights. Our report identifies human dignity as a central explanatory notion in both our founding documents and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although to varying degrees of explicitness. The authors of these documents recognize that human nature is special, according those who possess it the ability and principle to think, to choose, and to engage creatively with the material world around them. Such capacities, rooted in human nature as they are, indicate a unique excellence and value to beings possessing that nature, which we'll call human dignity. Now, this dignity is misunderstood and human rights are degraded if it's thought of as an achievement of human beings. Human achievement manifests human dignity, but it's not a presupposition of it. And clearly all human beings at some stage of life, whether because of age, impoverishment, disability, or other impairment, are incapable of realizing the full range and excellence that dignity generally makes possible. But if dignity was indexed to achievement, then dignity and presumably rights also would be possessed intermittently or only to degrees across the human family. But dignity pertains to human nature and hence equally to all human beings. And the Universal Declaration rightly recognizes that only when dignity is seen as inherent in humanity can we speak meaningfully of the, quote, equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. So the equal and inherent dignity of each human being underwrites and grounds the equal and unalienable rights of those beings. Do we need to say more? I think we do, because there's a problem with dignity's apparent lack of content. It's widely recognized that the language of dignity, like the language of rights, can be found on opposing sides of the most significant moral controversies, such as those over abortion or euthanasia. And if dignity is to be more than just an invocation, it needs to have some more contentful understanding provided to it in order for it to provide the foundation for rights. Now, I'm going to just dip a toe into Paolo's section, if I may. In section 3B of the report, I think we indicate exactly where that more contentful understanding needs to be found. Quote, the Universal Declaration's integrated set of rights begins to flesh out the meaning and implication of human dignity by emphasizing the flourishing and community that liberty makes possible, end quote. So I think here, flourishing in community is the key phrase, for flourishing in community is constituted precisely by the pursuit and realization of genuine human goods, goods such as life, health, friendship, marriage, knowledge, work, play, personal integrity, religion. And human pursuit of these goods in community, and hence human flourishing, is protected by the demands of justice articulated in claims of right. That it is by right that you should not coerce me in religious worship, that it is by right that you should not hold my life to be taken at will or held in slavery, by right that the demands of truth should be honored in inquiry and free communication, by right that the needs of children should be protected by safeguards aimed at strengthening marriage and families. So I think this crucial sentence in our report likewise situates liberty in its relationship to human flourishing in the right way. Human beings don't flourish simply because they choose autonomously. Their choices must instead be aimed at genuine goods to be fully reasonable. But human persons are unlikely to flourish if not granted the liberty to choose uprightly, inquire honestly, and worship with integrity. So liberty turns out to be a central part, I think, of the story here. Now, I think we could investigate the source of human this dignity even further. Could the excellence that human beings appear to possess really be the product of just material laws of nature, or do human dignity, goods, and rights instead point beyond those blind subpersonal forces to a transcendent divine origin? Bill, I'm 51 seconds over my 12 minutes. Can I go 2 more minutes?
Yeah, Chris, please keep going.
All right, thanks. I'm almost done. I think these are larger questions than the Commission was able to address. But we do note that the founding documents that we considered aren't as reticent on this topic. It's a familiar quotation, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, Jefferson's words are a statement of faith and not argument, but they're not unworthy of serious and reasoned consideration. For if there's no transcendent creator of human nature, if human beings are no more than matter in motion, or the product of unguided natural forces, one could rightly wonder what then of human dignity and what of human goods, human flourishing, and ultimately human rights. Now, the Commission's report notes these questions and I think, again, reasonably makes no effort to settle them. But I will say, it's a small criticism, I think that the report is a little too sanguine about the import of the answers. But here's a quotation from the report. However philosophical debates, it's that however that gets me a little bit, however philosophical debates about reason, nature, and God might be resolved, the Declaration's affirmation of rights inherent in all human beings everywhere has, over the centuries, become deeply woven into American beliefs, practices, and institutions, and undergirds the nation's moral and political inheritance. And I think, just to conclude, that one might wonder whether this overstates the extent that the Declaration's affirmations are found present in our common life and understates the threat found in currently popular views of human persons, of human nature, and of the divine. And one might worry that without some public understanding of and commitment to such a transcendent source of human dignity, the project of recognizing, protecting, and realizing universal human rights might be imperiled. So those who share the Universal Declaration's, quote, faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, end quote, ought, I think, to be open to the possibility that a secularism that takes materialistic atheism as the default position of good intellectual sense could have bad consequences in the long run for human rights. As we note in our report, respect for human rights is a matter of both law and also of culture. And so I think one takeaway from the report is that we should strive to build a culture in which the more than merely human or natural sources of human natural rights are appropriately acknowledged, rather than, as increasingly seems to be the case today, at best, begrudgingly tolerated. Thanks. Paolo, I'm handing it over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Well, let me start by reiterating where you began, which is with the really extraordinary privilege it was to work with this group of people. I will add to it that it was striking what wonderful diversity there was within the group, a point that has not always been appreciated by the critics of the commission. Diversity of background, of perspective, of politics, of morals, of faith. And not least, a diversity of disciplines academically and intellectually as well. So what you just heard was the reflections and contributions from our resident philosopher, and reflecting a particular perspective, a particular tone, a way of thinking about words that was an invaluable contribution to the report as a whole. My own perspective and that of Ken to follow me are as legal scholars, as jurists, as practicing lawyers, and in many ways that gives us a different way of approaching these questions. So the next section of the report, the one that I'm going to spend my time commenting on, is itself something that I think, after the more heavily theoretical and philosophical premises that have been laid out in the first section, takes them up and tries to apply them in various practical ways, specifically to the project of international human rights law in a variety of ways, beginning in particular with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there have been some questions, persistent ones, about the work of the Commission even before we issued our report, as to why we were limiting ourselves, it has been asked, to the Universal Declaration, or why give such central importance to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as such. There's a large corpus of international human rights law that was the beginning document in 1948, and I think that some would have very much liked to see us simply say, well, that's past now. We've overcome that initial moment has now been replaced by a variety of other human rights instruments over time. So why begin a document like this with the Universal Declaration? Well, the narrow and simple reason is, as you heard from Bill Saunders, that was explicitly the mandate that was given to us by the Secretary of State to ground the principles that we were articulating in the Universal Declaration. But there are better reasons for that as well, or additional ones that we try to emphasize at the beginning of this section. One is simply to appreciate what an extraordinary achievement the Universal Declaration was. It is unprecedented as a document in human history, in the way that it tries to give expression and voice to the longing and desire and judgment about the requirements of human dignity across all cultures, across all languages, throughout history in a universal way. And that aspiration itself was something that is worth returning to and remembering. Secondly, because as a document overall that is aimed at trying to articulate principles that would help guide US policy with regard to human rights, it is worth returning to the Universal Declaration to emphasize that the United States played a crucial role in its formation, in its drafting, in its adoption and approval, and endorsed it in very strong ways in 1948, at the time that it was drafted and presented and approved to the states of the United Nations at the time. And in substance, one can see that within the text of the Universal Declaration. There are all sorts of ways in which it is not a complete mirror of, but has strong links to the traditions of rights recognition and protection in the US constitutional system and history and language. So this helps to ground what we're going to do in a moment that had particular significance for the United States, and then to carry it forward from there. This carrying forward is an additional point that's worth emphasizing from the start. There have been some, I think, commentators on the Commission's report that, seeing the emphasis on the Universal Declaration, I think have misperceived the emphasis and think that, well, that what must be going on is an attempt to freeze or fix the notion of international human rights at the Universal Declaration, and ignore the fact that there are subsequent legal instruments and 70 years of history and a broad corpus of human rights. And as you'll see when you read the report carefully, if you haven't already, that in fact, that nothing could be further from the truth, that there's a very clear acknowledgement, and I'll say more about it in a few minutes, that this is not an originalist project with respect to the Universal Declaration, but rather simply an effort to return to the first principles and the roots from which certain projects begin. By returning to the beginning, often it is one of the best ways to renew the original impetus and ideal that animated the project. And so if our goal is, as is made clear by the Commission from the beginning, to emphasize the centrality and importance of human rights to United States foreign policy and the distinctive responsibility that the United States has for those rights, then the idea is that one of the best ways to do so is to return to the roots and say, this is what first gave birth to it. This is what first animated it. This is what first connected it to a longer tradition of constitutional, legal, theoretical, philosophical, social discourse in the United States, so that we can renew the same commitment that began there. So moving then to the next sections of this part of the report. It begins really with simply a close reading of the Universal Declaration itself. And I think this is not an insignificant methodological move, if you will. It is certainly my belief as a longtime professor of human rights as well as practitioner in human rights institutions, that notwithstanding its fame and seminal importance from a historical point of view, the Universal Declaration is often not even read and even less understood. So merely the encouragement to go back and read it carefully, read it as an instrument that has a certain sort of integrity and logic to it, and then try to follow those implications forward, is itself an important exercise that we should all be engaged in. And some of the things we highlight when we do so is, first of all, the way that, as I already mentioned briefly, the Universal Declaration breaks new ground for the community of nations in elevating the ideals of human dignity and freedom and the requirements of justice to what is unequivocally a question of international concern. And again, we take that for granted today, but in 1948, it was absolutely revolutionary to do so. And so it's important to remember what an achievement that is, and that has implications even for today. Secondly, we note that there was a distinctive method used by the drafters of the Universal Declaration in arriving at this particular list, in overcoming the challenge of the diversity of cultures, of languages, of historical and economic and political realities, to arrive at a common statement about certain fundamental principles. And the methods that they chose were, first of all, to really focus on achieving a practical consensus. What are those things that we can agree are always wrong, even if we may have different views about where they come from or why they're wrong? And secondly, to focus on a small number of very general principles. It was clear that certain things would not be able to achieve consensus in what was then a diverse group of nations, and is today an even more, much more significantly diverse group of nations. In other words, the implicit emphasis is that to genuinely be able to construct a system for the recognition and protection and promotion of human rights on a global scale, we really need to emphasize the ability to identify and strengthen the consensus across the great diversity of human cultures and human realities. Thirdly, as Chris Tollefsen already mentioned, I don't need to say much more about it, is the fact that the project that is launched by the Universal Declaration is clearly grounded in the idea that human beings as such, qua human beings, have an inestimable value, a value that's not given by law, that's not given by politics, that's not created, and that cannot be taken away, but it is inherent and inalienable and equal. Next, the report emphasizes that the Universal Declaration was not, and was not intended to be, a legal document. Now, this has a certain significance that I'll come back to when we talk about positive law in a few minutes. So it's not pointed out as a way of emphasizing that the positive law of human rights that then develops is in any way, a misstep or something that's not justified, but rather returning to the fact that the Universal Declaration begins with statements of a political and cultural, pedagogical and aspirational nature, helps to remind us, as Chris Tollefsen also said with regard to the first section, that human rights can't be only a matter of law, that in fact a culture and a society that is protective of the dignity of human persons begins at a cultural level, at a pre-political level, and without those cultural and pre-political and social foundations, one can construct a very elegant system of positive law that will in fact have no effect. So to remind us of these social roots. And finally, this sort of close reading of the Universal Declaration emphasizes that the drafters understood and wrote it in such a way that showed they understood that human rights, even universal principles of human rights, can be, and in fact inevitably are, instantiated in different ways in different human cultures. And that therefore the pluralism or the plurality of different ways in which these rights can take shape and be specified in the context of law and politics and economics and human relations is not a contradiction to the universality of the principles, but rather, in fact, is a necessary consequence of how you take universal principles and realize them concretely in human societies. And so there's a certain emphasis on the fact that the human rights project, beginning with the Universal Declaration, needs to be one that seeks to reconcile universal principles of human dignity and justice with the specificities of human cultures and the way that they take shape. So the next section after that basically says, okay, given these sort of core ideas that we get out of a close reading, in fact, a number of persistent questions arise and have arisen throughout history. Hard questions that aren't easy to resolve, and to which there can be reasonable differences of opinion, and we struggle with them. I won't mention all of them in the interest of time, but a few of them that I think are more important. The first is the idea of sovereignty. If human rights have become global standards, then what becomes of national sovereignty? And we have a section that talks about the way that sovereignty properly understood is in fact reconcilable and can be in harmony with obligations assumed for the protection of human rights. We also emphasize that the Universal Declaration, having to be read as an integrated instrument with all the rights interconnected with one another as a whole and not severable, means that all of the different parts of the Universal Declaration need to be taken seriously, including in particular, as we point out, the economic and social and cultural rights, which are in the latter part of the statement. This is a pretty significant observation in the context of a document that aims to inform US foreign policy, because it has not always been the case, in fact, mostly has not been the case, that the US foreign policy establishment has been willing to recognize, even at a theoretical level, the importance of economic and social rights. We take up the question of hierarchy, which was raised many times with the Commission by our witnesses and by some of the written submissions to us, and whether some rights are more important than others. And we sort of grapple with the question of how, in theory, and in important ways, all human rights are essential and not in hierarchy, because they all pertain to the essential aspects of human dignity and the requirements of justice. And yet, there are a variety of practical ways, both in the law and in the politics of human rights, in which priorities need to be established among them in their practical pursuit. We spend a long time talking about the development of new rights and the recognition of rights beyond the Universal Declaration. Clearly, the document says very clearly that rights do need to evolve and to grow, that new challenges and threats to human dignity arise, new insights into the requirements of justice arise as our societies mature in their reflection over those questions. And yet at the same time, it can't be the case, just as a matter of logic and practice, that anything that is asserted as a right necessarily is a right, that every desire becomes a right. There are contested assertions of what ought to be recognized as a right. So we try to articulate certain criteria that could be used to help discern when it's appropriate to recognize a new right and when it isn't. And finally, there are some sections that reflect on the way that the Universal Declaration relates to the positive law of human rights that has grown up after it. And the section makes quite clear that in many ways, the development of a positive international law of human rights is definitely something to be welcomed and is important. That, again, going back to the quotation that Professor Tollefsen gave us from the first section, the relationship between positive rights or positive law and these first principles of human dignity is an essential one. The first principles need positive law in order to be realized. And there are certain things that can only be done through the development of law. So that is to be welcomed. At the same time, we take pains to say that if human rights really are what they claim to be, first principles that belong inherently to human persons necessarily, then they're not granted by positive law, and they can't be exhausted by positive law. We can't simply reduce the question of what is human rights to the question of what happens to be codified in a treaty today, but rather there needs to be a critical examination of that law, always relative to the first principles of them. And so even while we welcome the creation of treaties and institutions, we need to maintain a certain kind of a capacity to judge whether the development of the positive law is consistent with the first principles that are required. And that is the best way to continue to advance and to adhere to the core ideas of human person, of the dignity of the human person from which all of this began. So from there, the report then tries to take the first two sections and at last turn to what really is the core question that we were asked, which is, how should any of this inform US foreign policy? And here I'll turn it over to Ken Anderson.
Unmute. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Paolo and Christopher, for leading us up to this point. And I guess one of the striking features about the ordering of the report is that when we come to this part 4 of the report on human rights and US foreign policy, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road in a certain way, that we've been laying out a framework for how to understand these things. And yet the charge that we were given from the secretary was to essentially give principles that would give some basis for how human rights ought to inform US foreign policy, and through the lens or through the its intersection with the US constitutional tradition of unalienable rights, which is different from the overall universal human rights project as it might be seen in some way that takes no special account of the US, distinct from sort of any other actor in this. So this is, in a sense, the part that tries to get most practical while yet remaining still a discussion about first principles in relation to US first principles in a sense. So let me describe how the parts of this section of the report break out to give a sense of what kinds of points are being made. And the first is really to locate the universal but modern, in a sense, 1948 going forward, Universal Declaration of Human Rights within the context of US history and its history in the world and international relations, foreign affairs, these aspects. And of course, much of this takes place during the Cold War, but the report points out, I think quite correctly, that in a practical sense, much of what we're talking about here takes off politically, achieves a certain kind of resonance in US foreign policy as human rights, framed as human rights, not just certain kinds of values that are sort of back there, but framed in the language of human rights. That most takes off as we get into the 1970s, on into the 1980s and beyond. And of course, President Jimmy Carter famously associated with the kind of official linkage of human rights to American foreign policy. I don't think that he was so much declaring something new as he was formalizing the fact that the United States, its people, its culture, its dealings with the world at large, has always had some strand of ideals as well as interests being at stake. And I think in a sense, he was formalizing that in the late 1970s in terms of the language of human rights that was emerging out of the Universal Declaration and later documents. This takes off in a certain way also through the later part of the Cold War, and as a language that was used to give aid and comfort to dissidents in the Soviet Union and the communist bloc countries at the time. And that this put the sovereign power of the United States in a certain sense behind a certain idealism. and behind a certain set of ideals. Now, the Cold War comes to an end, and with the Cold War coming to an end, there is a peculiar transition that the report describes in part, which is a belief that human rights becomes essentially merged into a sort of larger political project of international law and governance by international or global institutions, and a de-emphasizing of sovereignty and sovereign power. And this then leads to the second section of this chapter on US foreign policy and human rights, which is to say, well, yeah, but not necessarily for the US in this. The US takes its international obligations extraordinarily seriously, which is a reason why it is very careful about what it commits itself to. But at the end of the day, the US conception of human rights is one which is put together with its own constitutional view of the self-governance of the United States through its people, through its democratic institutions, through its constitutional structure. And while countries differ, and the liberal democracies differ among themselves as to how much deference to accord to international treaties of human rights on international norms put out by various kinds of groups and institutions, the United States has always been very clear that there is a hierarchy of authority here, and that the US Constitution is for the United States, the law of the United States at the top. And that is actually troubling to numbers of even our close allies that have got a sense that international human rights treaties, once entered into, achieve a sort of parity with the Constitution of that particular place. And these kinds of considerations lead to the United States having a somewhat distinct position in the world, apart from all the other things that distinguishes the United States, its size, its relative power, and so on, that it has a constitutional tradition that is not going to be replaced by some other form of power at the international level or form of authority at the international level. And the report makes a lot of reference to the idea that that different cultures, different societies, different nations can approach some of these things in different kinds of ways, which is completely true. And the United States does as well. And to that end, the challenge then comes, well, you guys can do it your way. We're China. Why can't we do it our way? Right? And our way happens to have a lot of things that one might think are not so great. But if everybody is permitted, if each nation is permitted to sort of make its own choices about culture in these kinds of ways, then why shouldn't an authoritarian communist regime capable of monumentally large-scale repression against the Uyghurs, for example, why shouldn't they be able to just assert themselves and say, this is our conception of human rights? I think that the US has a response to that, which is communism, autocracy, authoritarianism, the denial of democracy, the denial of kind of basic civil liberties, these kinds of things. They aren't just a choice. The kind of flexibility and differences of approach that we're talking about are things that pertain to liberal democracies in the world. Places that have got liberal democratic self-governance, the rule of law, and maybe you ought to try those things, and then maybe you could wind up having a sort of place in the world in which you could talk about having a distinctive approach to human rights that yet remains recognizably in some way human rights. This section on US foreign policy then turns to, I think, the core of the matter in an important sense, which is there are lots of new challenges out there in the world, and these challenges include the rise of a new geopolitics, the rise of China, a much more assertive internationally Russia, and perhaps most important, the presentation of authoritarian governance by the single party, the China model, as being a genuinely legitimate alternative to liberal democracy as a governance form over a people, over a society. And that presents very new challenges, in a sense not new because they were part of what the Cold War was all about, but more directly presented as a challenge to the United States and to other liberal democracies in the world than it has been in decades and decades. And that's a new challenge. And it's a new challenge to US foreign policy, and certainly has to be part of the reason that the Secretary was asking for a restatement of these kinds of principles. And in a way, you can see what this commission has done as being a restatement of general principles and say, well, so what? How does this advance the ball? How does this sort of move the margin forward? How does this wind up giving us anything we didn't already have? Isn't this just kind of, toss it in a drawer? We've been there, done that. We know all this already. But the answer, I think, is that in the world in which we currently live, a restatement of first principles is actually incredibly important to inform US foreign policy and that of our allied liberal democracies, because those principles are under challenge in a way that they have not been really since the Cold War. Those first principles are under challenge. And so for that reason, I think that a sort of core aspect of US foreign policy in relation to human rights is to take first principles that we've, for a very long time, embraced and said we believe in, and recommit ourselves to those things. Understanding, and I'll close on this point, that in the real world in which we live, there will always have to be trade-offs between ideals and interests and other kinds of concerns, even beyond human rights. There will also have to be prudent judgments that may turn out to be wrong, made by political leaders, made by diplomats, made by all sorts of people, where we have to, in some sense, take into account uncertainties about the future, fear of unintended consequences, and all of the things that go into statecraft and the fashioning of a foreign policy. And in a sense, you can say that we face a choice, and I'll close here, between purity on the one hand and danger on the other. You can't afford to be entirely pure, because the world in which we live is a dangerous, and I think the report reflects a concern, much more dangerous place than it has been for a long time. And therefore, a sort of restatement and reinvigoration of our first principles makes a lot of sense. And Bill, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ken and Chris and Paolo. I just, a couple of brief remarks from the conclusion of the report, although I'm sure you can see all these from the presentations that you've just heard. But it was a difficult task given the commission, I think, but as they say here, they offer some concluding observations to those who bear the heavy responsibility of framing a moral foreign policy that advances American interests while remaining true to American ideals. That's a big job. And some of the things in their concluding observations, I won't mention them all, but I'll just mention a few. Again, that the U.S. should champion human rights in U.S. foreign policy, that human rights are universal and indivisible, but nonetheless, the principle of subsidiarity means that there's a flexibility in how a nation realizes human rights. Freedom, democracy, and human rights are indissolubly linked. And it was, as was mentioned, social and economic rights are essential to a comprehensive foreign policy. We may say some more words about that later, but the U.S. has observed that through its economic aid, etc. And then the last thing, which I just read a couple of sentences from the report, that the seed beds of human rights must be cultivated. Over the years, human rights idea has shown great power to the point where, quote, human rights has become the phrase most commonly used today by millions of men and women from all nations and cultures to express their yearnings for justice and relief from oppression. But friends of human rights must keep in mind two important considerations. One, respect for human rights must be cultivated, and two, the promotion of basic human rights the promotion of human rights is only one element in building the kind of societies that promote human flourishing in all its dimensions. The experience of the United States teaches that protection of human rights is a never-ending struggle, one that involves a nation's sense of its own principles and purposes as it grapples with questions about security and well-being of the political community. So that's the report. I want to ask each of you, what your hope is that this report accomplishes. And let's just go in the order we did before: Chris, and then Paolo, and then Ken.
Okay. I guess my hope, I mean, for a document that is sort of foreign policy facing, the hope that I'm going to articulate is very domestic facing. So obviously this report was being completed at a time where it seemed like the United States couldn't become any more fractured. This would be midsummer, right? Things seem to be kind of falling apart as a culture, as a country. And in many ways they still do. And I think that one of the really important things about the core thesis of this, which I'm going to characterize in the following way. I'll characterize the thesis, then I'll say what I think is really important about it. I think the core thesis is this: that there are rights that are things that are owed to human beings. And they're owed to them just because they're human beings. They're not brought about by political acts of will, so they're in some important sense pre-political. They need to be respected by political authority and secured by government at risk of political authority and government ceasing to be legitimate in some important sense. I think that set of theses that all hang together is as close to what you can get to what should be a sort of core statement of consensus and faith for American citizens as possible. I think it just, the document as a whole is just a really, I think, very impressive statement of what it is that, going to the sentence that you read at the end, right, should give us our own nation's sense of its own principles. Like, these are the principles that we should internalize and understand as constituting our identity. And I think if it did that, if it was successful in that, then it would go some way towards bringing a resolution to that sense of fracturing that that I, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one, felt like I was experiencing through a lot of the summer into the fall. And I'll say what I think is the big obstacle to this right now, or one big obstacle in terms of just this document, is that so many people were primed to hate it, that I don't see them reading it adequately. And so just this afternoon, I was reading a soon to be published critique of the document that accused accused the report of being overly individualistic, of overly concerned with economic values at the expense of human values, being negligent of the need to give reasons for the claims that we make, and of being over-religious. I don't see the document as succumbing to any of those failings. And I think that if it's given the chance, if people give it the chance to sort of read it with an open mind and an open heart, then it will go some way towards accomplishing this domestic task that I think is important, of identifying for us the core principles that I think we need to recommit to collectively as a nation.
Well, I would certainly endorse what Chris just said entirely, and in particular that, you know, my main hope is quite simply that the document be read, but that it be read with a certain sort of openness to its arguments, and I don't mean agreeing with it necessarily, or any particular part of it, but that it be read as a document that was produced in good faith, that it means what it says, that it doesn't have hidden agendas or subtexts of what it's actually pursuing, and that people take it at face value. Now, I can offer sort of two other things that I hope for that I think are at a more specific level too. And I'll get at this by saying a little bit just about my experience in the field of human rights. In the politics and practice of human rights, it's been my experience that it is very, very difficult to avoid one of two extremes. On the one hand, for those who practice human rights and who work in it, who dedicate their lives to it, and who make heroic sacrifices to do so, I'm not minimizing it at all, it's very hard to be critical of the Human Rights Project. One has to be celebratory of it in every respect. And it's very rare to hear any voices of criticism within it. In part because the other extreme is the one that simply says the Human Rights Project is, for various reasons, corrupt, untenable, not worth pursuing, and something to be rejected and set aside. And it's very difficult to find voices that try to enter the middle ground and simultaneously endorse unequivocally the importance and centrality of the human rights ideal, and yet at the same time be able to take a certain degree of critical distance from it and say, here's some things that aren't going so well within it. Here's some things that could be strengthened. Here are some hard questions within it that we should struggle with. Here are some of its ambiguities. And so if we can open up some of that space for a good faith, critical engagement that aspires to strengthen and advance the protection of human rights, then I think we will have accomplished a lot.
So I want to fully endorse what it is that Christopher and Paolo both said, and to sort of add one little bit on that, I guess I'd say, I do think that there is a hugely important role that this kind of document ought to be able to play in the sort of domestic life, as Christopher says. And I also completely agree that it would be a great thing if a document like this could bring about a certain amount of self-reflection, critical self-reflection to the institutional human rights movement out of which both Paolo and I come. But I guess I would want to sort of add to that a sense that a document like this can be read as just pure description. This is just a sort of statement of principles, purely descriptively. But I don't think that that's what the members of the commission were looking to do. And I think that particularly the concluding language that Bill comes back to in the including observations. They're not just observations. They are a call to commitment in a certain way, and they are looking to motivate, and they are looking to recommit US foreign policy in a changed world environment in some way that will wind up stating that these kinds of ideals are fully part of who we are and what we do, and we won't apologize for that or anything like that. And at the same time, wind up pointing out that the obligation to do justice has to carry with it the power to be able to do it. And that means that it has to be done in a way which will be effective. And that will always carry one back to the facts and circumstances and judgments that have to be made about power and the use of power. And so in that sense, I hope that it's motivational, both on the side of motivating those who are sort of making those judgments and the sort of democratic commitment to them, and to at the same time understanding their prudent and practical limits, at least in any sort of immediate moment. Bill, I guess I'd leave it there.
Thank you all. I realize I should have said this before, but if you have a question, in the middle of your screen at the bottom, there's a Q&A tab, and you can send in questions through that. I think we have a couple of people who were smart enough to figure that out before I did mention it. But so I'll raise a couple of these. One, it says for Paolo, but I think it's open obviously to you other two if you'd like to comment. How do rights progress while, and in quotes, progress while remaining the same in their fundamental core? Which aspect of the right is core and which right is subject to change?
That might be a question that's more for Chris than for me, actually. It's a, sort of an interesting philosophical question about the nature of rights and first principles. But addressing it, I mean, as best I can, I guess I would simply say this. I mean, even while the basic principle is true that, for example, it's always wrong to enslave someone, right? We, over time, encounter new forms of human oppression that may or may not be quite like slavery. And we need to reflect on, you know, is every form of bonded labor a form of slavery? What do we do about human trafficking? Is that slavery, or is it, you know, or the opposite? I mean, in the 19th century, with the emergence of an industrial economy, there were many who analogized wage labor to slavery from a moral point of view. So we need to be able to distinguish. So the development of the right is in large part, I think, a reflection on the applicability of the first principles, which remain unchanged, to new circumstances, and that demand that we also reflect also on the, you know, go back to the first principle and reflect on what exactly is its scope and what is its meaning and what is it that animated for? Why did we identify that as a core aspect of human flourishing that needs to be protected? And as circumstances change and as our understanding of the first principle matures, in part through the reflection provoked by the changed circumstances, we continue to try to attain a reflective equilibrium between our reflection on the first principles and their actual application. Now, you know, I'm wading beyond my territory into Chris's, and so I'd love to hear what he has to say about it too.
I thought that was great, Paolo. I guess I would just, I'll just give one example that really just picks up on what Paolo was saying. But if you take this example of enslavement, our understanding of the right against enslavement needs to be developed. And Paolo gave the example of trafficking. We could go in radically different directions and see the way in which the right against enslavement also might have application. If we think of questions at the beginning of life, is the genetic manipulation of embryos in order to make them what you want them to be, is that similar enough to slavery that we should think that it's a violation of something like the same human right? Is the cryopreservation of embryos so that they can then be used for scientific experimentation similar enough to slavery that we should think that it's a violation of the same right? And right there, you also see a different intersection where our understanding of the right needs to grow with regard to our understanding of scope. Right now, my own view is that our understanding of the scope of human rights is radically deficient in terms of our failure to apply this principle that I articulated from our document of human rights applying to all human beings, because we don't acknowledge human beings at the earliest stages of human life. That's a way in which our understanding, appreciation, and the practical upshot of a core human right, could be expanded, both with regard to our appreciation of its genuine scope and with regard to its application in a field that we might not otherwise think is really where it should be applied.
Do you want to say anything, Ken, on that?
No.
Okay.
I think I'm beyond my competency in that. Yes.
Okay, here's another question. What is the practical effect of documents like the UN Declaration of on Human Rights and the Commission report, especially with respect to totalitarian regimes? For example, how do these articulations of human rights actually work to restrict regimes violating human rights like the CCP's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims? Ken, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I guess looking back to the post-Universal Declaration history going back to 1948, I always come back to the memoirs of Henry Kissinger, who I think would be accurately described and would accurately describe himself as a pure interests kind of guy when it comes to foreign policy, foreign affairs, the United States and its place in the world. And yet by the time he gets around to writing his memoirs, after the Cold War has ended and sort of a decade or so in between, one of the most striking features about that is toward the end when he says, I can no longer say how, I can no longer deny the importance of the Helsinki Accords that recognized human rights implicitly in the sort of Cold War, late Cold War meeting between East and West, and the role that ideas, the role that ideals, the role that human rights as an idea played in terms of shaping the end of the Cold War and helping to bring it about on Western democratic terms. China, I think, presents the most difficult problem in that regard, because I think that China has absorbed and learned lessons that totalitarians of the past 70, 80, 90 years learned the hard way and not always successfully, and that China has absorbed those lessons, and it thinks that it knows how it can sort of steer a path through remaining communist, remaining totalitarian, remaining authoritarian, and massively violating human rights when it feels it's in its interest to do so, and yet not wind up sort of having these costs imposed on it by the human rights ideals, even as represented by powerful states in the West, starting with the United States. I truly hope that turns out to be wrong. I also think that authoritarians, totalitarians, and dictators and tyrants have a way of profoundly miscalculating at some point how things will play out in their world. So treat that as an expression of faith in some way, but I also don't think that the US has a choice about it. It is who we are, and we've got to be clear about that, and I would say quit apologizing for it.
Paolo, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, quickly, I could add a few things. I really liked what Ken had to say. You know, one is, as he said, to not underestimate the power of moral ideals. And we, you know, we've seen that any number of times. That's very much what led to the collapse of much of the Soviet Empire. And the second thing is that those moral ideals often take shape through domestic political movements as well, right? And so very often what the Universal Declaration has done is that it has inspired political opposition. It has animated, it has given them direction and a sense that that they're supported by the world. And you know, you can see that in very tangible ways. And for example, the entire third wave of democratization, which began in the 1980s, was deeply informed by the ideals of human rights that had been endorsed at a global level. And the third and last thing is, you know, with respect to the really hard cases, the Chinas, the North Koreas, the Cubas, you know, change is something that is only going to come out in over a very long time horizon, and we need to be you know, sort of patient about that and persistent and persevere in hoping for and trying to bring about that change. That doesn't mean that human rights doesn't have a central role to play in it. It just means to be realistic that asserting a catalog of human rights does not by itself in a direct way lead to the collapse of regimes that are incompatible with those ideals.
Chris, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's great.
You know, I would like to ask you, give you each an opportunity if you want to. I mean, there's obviously been some criticisms of the report. I mean, I very much appreciate the report and the difficult task, and I think that the commission did a quite good job in responding to it. But I don't know if any of you, if there's a particular criticism that you would like an opportunity to respond to that you think is perhaps, you know, particularly misguided. If not, I have other questions in the queue, but I did want to give you an opportunity.
I'd be glad to say something about that. And you know, I've been involved in some debates over it, and I've read some of the printed criticism. And I think one of the things that is most frustrating that I've encountered repeatedly is a criticism that in fact doesn't actually engage what the report says, but rather dismisses it and attacks it on the basis of who said it. And by who said it, I don't mean the members of the commission, although perhaps that also, but simply because of the fact that it was commissioned by Secretary Pompeo, that Secretary Pompeo is part of the Trump administration. It becomes essentially a form of ad hominem argument. And like every other form of ad hominem argument, it really does not address the substance of what is being said. And so I'd just like to emphasize that, you know, the report, as I said before, means what it says. It's not perfect. There are all sorts of ways in which it is open to reasonable criticisms and disagreements. I myself, like Chris did in his comments, could easily point out the things that I would like to see changed or elaborated or different in it. But what I'd really like to see is the actual engagement of the arguments themselves, and not a deflection that ignores the actual report and focuses instead on some putative you know, bad intentions about its origins.
Oh, could I add real quickly to what Paolo was saying? I think even
Yes.
more than going beyond sort of the negating bad intentions, I think it's important to recognize a particular, I think, good intention, and one could argue in various ways that was at work here. I think that the document really is a tremendous effort at civility with regard to the history that it provides of civil rights within the United States. One criticism that it seems to me frequently is made that there's a sort of deliberate and malicious negation of LGBTQ rights and the movement, the civil rights movement that bears on that. And I think the reason that that's absent is we brought the story, the history, up to the point at which cultural consensus comes to an end, right? There are disputed issues that arise after the point in the 1960s with the high point of the civil rights movement, where I think as a culture we're all together. And we didn't go beyond that point with regard to one contested set of rights, but we also didn't go beyond that point with regard to another contested set of rights, the contested set of rights having to do with reproductive rights and women's rights and the rights of the unborn. And I think that was, that although that's seen as an act of malintention, I think it was actually on our part an act of good intention. It was an attempt, again, to capture a certain kind of consensus that was available to us as a nation with regard to basic human rights, and leave open the question of how these more contested issues should be resolved through the democratic process, and not stipulate one way or the other the way that any particular set of commissioners, much less the whole group of commissioners, thought that they should go. And I think that's, and in a weird way, the opposite of what we intended is being interpreted in the reading of the document.
Ken, did you want to say anything?
I will confess that I stuck my head in the sand on exactly these questions, didn't read any of the criticisms of what it was we were doing, and simply attempted to march forward under our mandate as it stood. I don't think that was a very heroic thing to do, but it did make my life actually, I think, a lot easier and happier than the chairperson, Marianne Glendon's life, who had to contend with those things. So that's my public confession, Bill.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to all three of you. I think we've about come to the end of our time. I also want to say thank you to Professor Glendon as chair of the commission. She is one of the, the great leaders of human rights in the world. And thank you for your efforts on the commission. Our students will study it, and we will talk about it, and it will inform our reflection. And I hope it will for many other Americans, as I think Chris mentioned a second ago, that there are sections in the report that talk about how do you think about a new human right, one that's not already in a document that recognizes the rights, and it provides guidelines or thoughts on how you would enter into that conversation. And if our nation or the world has any kind of future, part of it has to be through an informed, good faith conversation among people of goodwill about how to resolve certain issues and to promote truths about the human person, the common good. So again, thank you to all three. Thank you to the audience. And I look forward to our fourth human rights lecture next fall. Thank you, everybody.